If you can hear me, clap once. You can hear me, clap 5 times. All right, it kind of worked. All right, guys. Whatever you answer to the question, it's probably going to go downhill the rest of the weekend. It's probably just going to get less and less. So, all right. Well, good morning, everybody. I know there's a lot of new faces here, which is really awesome. So, if we've never met before, my name is Kevin, and I am one of the pastors on staff at Medina East. And I say this every time that Colin still lets me come on one of these, but so in my previous life, before I was on staff at Medina East, I got to work, I do some college ministry at the University of Akron for a college ministry called Campus Focus. And so I spent about 13 years of my life doing college ministry and working with young adults, and it was awesome. It was one of my, I probably shouldn't say it, but I think it was my favorite job. Like, I like what I do now, but that was probably my favorite job. And so I'm just excited to be here. I'm excited about the stage of life you guys are in. Colin did not pay me to say this, but if I could give you a sales pitch, every time they offer a retreat, you should 1,000% go on it, right? Like, until you get old enough that Colin kicks you out of the ministry, if there's a retreat and you're like, I don't know, you should go on it, because once you get into the old world where I'm at, you will long to go back to a moment where you could go on a retreat like this and get away with your peers and just have fun. And so he didn't pay me to say this, but this is my unofficial sales pitch. You're here, you did the right thing this time, but whenever he offers one next time, you guys should go on it. So my family gets to be here too with me this weekend, and so you've probably seen some of them around. So that is my wife, Liz, in the hat, and then my oldest daughter, Riley, who is 12 today. Today is her birthday. If you see her, make a big deal out of it, embarrass her. We like to do that in our family, so you can embarrass her. That Hudson is 9, and then Harper is 5, and they'll be around all weekend. We're just kind of hanging out, and so if you see them running around and you are like, I wonder what they're doing, they would love it if you would play with them. They would love something to do. You can go block my son's shot in basketball or play gaga ball with them. They would have a lot of fun. So excited that they get to be here too. So as we get started, I want to start by asking you a question, and the question is going to seem kind of random, but it's going to set up where we're going. So the question I want to ask you is, are you fast? No. Right? Like, would people consider you a fast person? So again, this seems like a random question, but this is actually a question that I've been asked many times over the course of my life. And if you asked me to answer that question right now, I'd say probably not, right? Because I'm old now, and I am no longer what I once was. It just kind of started going downhill. But for the vast majority of my life, I would have answered yes to that question. So if you had found the elementary school version of me, I would have said, yes, I'm fast. So we used to have timed races in gym class. We used to do this thing called the shuttle run with an eraser. We had to get this eraser. Someone said yes. Do they still do that? Is that still a thing?
We're just both old.
Grace remembers. So they did this shuttle run test, and we had a 50-yard dash at our school, and we had all these races and events at field day, and I was always like one of the kids that was just faster. So I liked them because I felt good about myself after it. And then fast forward to middle school. So I went to Brunswick, and we had probably about 500 kids in our middle school. And so in middle school, I went out for the track team, and I was part of the 4x1, which means in theory, you're one of the 4 fastest kids if they're putting you on the team. So again, if you asked me in middle school, are you fast? I would have said, yeah, I think I'm pretty fast, right? I wasn't the fastest kid, but I was up there. You move into high school. In high school, again, I was on the track team, so I ran hurdles and I pole vaulted. But in the hurdle race, actually, I don't think this exists anymore either, but I won the Pioneer Conference. So I don't know what they call it now, but it was like the Brunswick, Medina, Strongsville, like that school thing. I won the 110 hurdles as a senior in that conference. And so again, I would have said, yeah, I think I'm a pretty fast kid. But there's one race that I had in high school that I will never forget. And so I think I was a sophomore in high school. It was an indoor track meet, and it was being held at Ohio State's Fieldhouse. And at that meet, I ran a hurdle race against a guy named Ryan Wilson, who went to Westerville North High School. And so his name was Ryan Wilson. And so in outdoor track, a hurdle race is 110 meters, and there are 10 hurdles in the race. In indoors, the race is only 60 meters, and it's 5 hurdles. So it's about half the distance. And during this race, my dad, just being a dad, took a picture of me running the race. And this is now a famous picture, infamous probably picture of my family, because there's a picture of me just crossing over the 3rd hurdle. And in the bottom far corner of the picture, you can see Ryan Wilson already over the 4th hurdle and heading towards the 5th hurdle, right? And so I'm losing by this is probably a 7 or 8 second race. So I'm 3 seconds into the race and I'm already 10 meters behind this guy. And so if you extrapolate that out to a full hurdle race, this guy's going to beat me by a good 30 meters. And if you don't know anything about track and field, the difference between first place and last place in most sprint races is fractions of a second, right? It's probably half a second behind in a good race. And so the fact that I would have lost by about 30 meters to this guy means I got absolutely destroyed by this guy. I can't even begin to explain how bad this guy kicked my butt. And so we didn't know this at the time, but here are a few fun facts about Ryan Wilson that I can now look back on, right? So Ryan went on to be named the Gatorade Track and Field Athlete of the Year, which is kind of a big deal. That same year, he actually won the state track and field team championship by himself. Not individual, he actually won the team championship by himself. So he took first place in the 110 hurdles, the 300 hurdles, the long jump, and he got 7th place in the 200. So he scored more points individually than any other team collectively in the entire state of Ohio, right? So he won the team championship. In college, he went on to USC, where he won a national championship. Post-college, he went on to win a silver medal at the World Championships, meaning he was the second fastest human alive at that event. And to this day, he is all-time currently in one of the top 20, he's in the top 20 fastest men of all time in that event. And so I had the privilege of running against him in a race when I was a sophomore in high school, and it did not go well for me. And so up until that point in my life, if you had asked me, are you fast, I would have given you a resounding yes, right? Even if I wasn't the fastest kid, I was always in the mix, I was up there, I belonged in the conversation. But on that day at Ohio State, if you had asked me if I was fast, I would have had to give you a resounding no, right? Because that day I learned what fast actually looked like. And on that day, if you had said, are you fast? I would have said, no, actually, I think I'm slow, and I think I suck at the hurdles, and I should probably just quit. I don't think I belong out here anymore, right? Because I just got beat that bad. Now, even if you're not a sports person, my guess is that all of us have probably had an encounter where we have met someone who was just that good at something, right? A time when we encountered someone who was so good at something that it kind of put us in our place, and it reminded us what it actually means to be good at that thing. And so maybe you're a musician and you think you're pretty good at playing the guitar. And then one day you meet someone who is crazy good at playing the guitar. Or maybe you're someone who is always, you considered yourself kind of to be the smart kid in the room. And then one day Billy transferred from the other school system and Billy gets a perfect score on the ACT and the SAT. And now when you're in the same room with Billy, not only do you not feel smart, you actually feel kind of dumb when you're around him because he's just that kind of smart. And the point is that all of us, we've all been humbled before when you've encountered someone who is just freakishly good at something. And when you encounter them and their greatness, unfortunately what it does is it reminds you of the things that you're maybe not so great at the same time. And so today we're going to look at a story where the prophet Isaiah has one of those kinds of encounters. And in this story, the prophet Isaiah, he has an encounter with God that both humbles him and it devastates him. And although this encounter is a difficult one for Isaiah, it also proves to be one of the most valuable moments of his entire life. So if you guys have a Bible with you, I want you guys to join me in the book of Isaiah chapter 6. As Colin said last night, if you don't have one with you, talk to Colin and we'll get you a Bible. But for this morning, all the verses are going to come up on the screen behind me as well. Now, in case you missed last night, if you're just getting here this morning, the theme of our retreat is called This is Grace. And the big idea of this retreat is that grace is not just a concept to be understood, but it is a reality to be experienced. So our hope for you this weekend is not just that you would learn some new facts about grace, but that you would have a first-hand encounter with grace. And so before we dive in, let me give you a little context for our passage. So the book of Isaiah was not surprisingly written by the prophet Isaiah. And if you're not familiar with the term prophet, it simply means that you were God's messenger, right? That God would literally give Isaiah messages, and he was then told to go and deliver those messages to God's people. And so in Isaiah 6, chapter 6, Isaiah tells us about a vision he has where he has this very unique encounter with God that's going to just utterly change his life forever. So here we go, Isaiah chapter 6. Here's what it says. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go forth? And I said, Here am I, send me. And so the first thing that Isaiah tells us is that this encounter happens in the year that King Uzziah died, right? Now that might seem like a pretty obscure and random fact to most of you. Some of you probably are like, I don't even care who King Uzziah is. But it's actually kind of important for a couple reasons. And the first reason this fact is important is because Isaiah is trying to root this moment in time and space and history. Right, as Isaiah attempts to describe to us an encounter that feels almost otherworldly, Isaiah is reminding us that this thing he is going to describe and he's trying to describe is an actual event which to us sounds unbelievable. He's saying this is an actual moment that took place in history. And so he's kind of grounding it in historical things. And the second reason this is so important is because of how and why history records for us that King Uzziah died. And so in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 26, again, kind of one of those obscure books that most of us just kind of read right past, we get some insights into exactly what led to Uzziah's death. So here's what it says in 2 Chronicles 26. It says, But after Uzziah became powerful, his pride led to his downfall. He was unfaithful to the Lord his God and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest, with 80 other courageous priests of the Lord, followed him in. They confronted King Uzziah and said, It is not right for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord. That is for the priests, the descendants of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Leave the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and you will not be honored by the Lord God. Uzziah, who had a censer in his hand ready to burn incense, became angry. While he was raging at the priests in their presence before the incense altar in the Lord's temple, leprosy broke out on his forehead. When Azariah the chief priest and all the other priests looked at him, they saw that he had leprosy on his forehead, so they hurried him out. Indeed, he himself was eager to leave because the Lord had afflicted him. King Uzziah had leprosy until the day he died. He lived in a separate house, leprous and banned from the temple of the Lord. Jotham, his son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. The other events of Uzziah's reign from beginning to end are recorded by the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. And so according to history, the reason that King Uzziah died was specifically a result of his sin, and it was a result of him wrongfully entering the presence of God. It was a result of him pridefully entering a restricted part of God's temple, something like he clearly knew that he was not supposed to do. And when he did, we're told that God struck him with leprosy, and that was essentially the beginning of the end for him. And so here's Isaiah, someone far less important, far less of rank than a king, also not a priest, about to enter the presence of God in his temple. And Isaiah reminds us that his encounter with God happens in the same year that King Uzziah, the most powerful man alive, was literally just killed for doing the same thing. And so here's what it says. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And so in Isaiah 6, the prophet Isaiah is trying to describe this otherworldly encounter that he has with God. And so he says that he sees God high and exalted. He's seated on his throne. The train of his robe is filling the temple. Right? Isaiah is kind of grasping at imagery to try to attempt to explain this thing that he's experiencing. And interestingly enough, in John chapter 12, it's actually John 12, verse 41, the Apostle John tells us that this was actually Jesus himself that Isaiah was looking at. That Isaiah was given a vision of the pre-incarnate Jesus, which is like super crazy to think about. So when you and I think about Jesus, we think of the human version of him, right? We think of the baby that you celebrate at Christmas. We think of the grown man that went to the cross that we celebrate at Easter. But Isaiah is given a vision of Jesus before those things happen, before he came to earth and he's still sitting on his throne. Again, super crazy to think about. And then here he tells us that there were seraphim there. And interestingly, this is the only place in the Bible where these seraphim are actually mentioned by name. There's one other place in the book of Revelation where they describe another creature that is kind of like this, that might be the same one. But in either case, these seraphim, they're mentioned in Isaiah 6. These are these angelic beings, and all we know is that they have 6 wings. Isaiah tells us with 2 they're flying, but with the other 4 they're actually kind of like, they're like shielding themselves from the presence of God. Almost like if you've ever been like driving down the road and you're driving like straight into a sunrise or a sunset and you can't see and you're driving, you're trying, like, it's like they're shielding themselves because it's so incredibly bright and hard to see. And so Isaiah goes on to tell us that these seraphim, that they're calling out to one another, and they say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. And so these angelic beings, they're in the presence of God, and the thing that they are repeatedly crying out is, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." Which begs the question, what does it mean to be holy? Right? What does it mean to be holy? And so in the Bible, the word holy, it simply means this. It means to be set apart. Right? Holy means to be set apart. And when the Bible says that we are to be set apart, it usually refers to being set apart in two different ways. And so when we're called to be set apart, it means to be set apart from sin and to be set apart for God's purposes. To be set apart from sin and set apart for God's purposes. And so let me show you some examples of this. And so in 1 Thessalonians, we read this. It says, "For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life." And in Hebrews 7, it says, "Such a high priest truly meets our needs, one who's holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens." And so part of what it means to be holy means to be set apart or to be distinct from sin. But holy also means to be set apart for God's purposes. And so an example of this, a great example of this, in Exodus 3, some of you guys, if you grew up in church, you remember the story of Moses at the burning bush. So here's in Exodus 3, here's what it says. He says, "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Right? And so when you think about what it means to be holy, a fair question to ask is, how in the world is ground holy? Right? Like, is this plot of dirt less sinful than this plot of dirt? Like, what does he mean when he says that the ground is holy, right? And so it's not holy because it's set apart from sin. It's holy because in that moment, that plot of ground is being set apart for God's purposes, right? And we actually find in Leviticus 20, God saying basically the same thing to the nation of Israel. Here's what he says. He says, "You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the nations to be my own." Right? So part of the reason the nation is called holy is not because they were sinless, but because God chose them and he set them apart for his purposes. And so in Isaiah 6, when the seraphim are chanting, "Holy, holy, holy," what they're trying to communicate is that God is completely set apart from the rest of creation. That he is wholly other, that he is completely unlike every other part of God's creation. And in addition, they're trying to communicate his moral purity. And so many commentators will tell you that this is actually what the seraphim, what they're shielding themselves from, right? That the holiness of God was so powerful that it was like a blinding light that they were trying to protect themselves from. In his book, Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer, he's talking about the holiness of God, and here's how he says it. He says, "Neither the writer nor the reader of these words is qualified to appreciate the holiness of God. Quite literally, a new channel must be cut through the desert of our minds to allow the sweet waters of truth that will heal our great sickness to flow in. We cannot grasp the true meaning of the divine holiness by thinking of someone or something very pure and then raising the concept to the highest degree we are capable of. God's holiness is not simply the best we know infinitely bettered. We know nothing like the divine holiness.
It stands apart, unique, unapproachable, incomprehensible, and unattainable. The natural man is blind to it. He may fear God's power and admire his wisdom, but his holiness he cannot even imagine.
Now, our passage in Isaiah was originally written in the Hebrew language. And in the Hebrew language, one of the things that God, one of the ways that they would emphasize things was through the art of repetition. And so if you or I were sending a text message to someone and we were trying to like emphasize something or to put some like strength behind it, like we would do things like this, like we'd put it in all caps, or maybe we'd add exclamation points at the end, or maybe we're trying to explain it where we'd do the mind blown emoji, right? We're trying to communicate something with emphasis and strength, and so this is how we would do it. But in the Hebrew, the way they showed emphasis was through repetition, right? That they would say things over and over and over. And so in the Hebrew language, if you say something once, it's important enough that you're saying it. If you say something twice, it is really important. And if you say something 3 times, that is like the strongest level of importance that you can communicate. It's the strongest level of expression available in the Hebrew language. And notice what Isaiah says the seraphim are saying, right? They are saying, holy, holy, holy. They are saying this with as much emphasis as their language allows them to communicate. Right? They're trying to communicate something that in their minds is almost borderline impossible to communicate. And so here's Isaiah. And Isaiah finds himself standing in the throne room of God himself. And he is confronted with the holiness and the glory of God. And here's Isaiah's response. He says, "Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." And so when Isaiah sees the holiness of God, he finds himself completely overwhelmed by it. When he sees God's holiness and his moral purity and all of its splendor, what Isaiah immediately recognizes is his own sin and his own depravity. When he sees himself in comparison to God, the text tells us that he is devastated by his sin. And so in his response is literally to curse himself, right? He says, "Woe to me." And that word woe is a word that Isaiah was very familiar with as a prophet. Right? Just one chapter before this, Isaiah is delivering, remember his job is to deliver messages. And so he's delivering a message of judgment to God's people. And over and over and over, Isaiah uses this word woe to declare God's judgment on him. So here's what he says literally in the chapter before.
He says, "Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field, till no space is left and you live alone in the land. Woe to those who draw sin along with cords of deceit and wickedness as with cart ropes. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks."
Right? And so this phrase that Isaiah normally uses to proclaim judgment on everyone else, he's now using on himself. Right? This time he says, "Woe to me." He says, "Woe to me." And he's literally declaring God's judgment on himself. When Isaiah realizes the depth of his sin, he thinks he's toast. He thinks he's a dead man, and I have to imagine that in this moment, Isaiah's mind would have immediately raced back to King Uzziah and everything that happened to him when he entered God's presence. You also have to remember that Isaiah, by most people's standards, was a pretty good dude. Right? In his day and age, compared to his peers, Isaiah would have been considered a very godly man and a very well-respected man, a man of high character, of high integrity. Right? If you think about it, like, he was literally God's prophet. Like, God chose him from among everyone to say, "Hey, I want you to represent me." And Isaiah is not, by most of our standards, a bad dude. But when Isaiah compares himself, not to his peers, but to God himself, he's devastated by his sin. And Isaiah's response is actually a pretty common one that you find in several places in Scripture. And so in the book of Revelation, when the Apostle John talks about seeing God, here's what he says. He says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet like I was dead." Or he's like, "I just saw him and I just dropped to the ground." And in Luke, when the Apostle Peter sees a glimpse of Luke, he says this. He says, "When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, 'Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man.'" Right? He sees Jesus and he's just like, I'm sinful. Like he's overwhelmed by it. Again, in the book of Job, we find the same thing. Job says this. It says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and I repent in dust and ashes. And all of these people, compared to their peers, these guys would have been top of the class. Like if you read the book of Job, God literally says this of Job. He says, there is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. That is God talking about Job. Like that, he's saying, like, this dude is awesome. And yet, after one single encounter with God, they all suddenly realize, I'm not fast anymore, right? Just like I did at that track meet, they suddenly realized this thing they thought they were good at, they're actually terrible at. And for all of these people, when they saw the glory of God, it opened their eyes to see the depths of their depravity. And they were devastated by the weight of their sin. And so as Colin mentioned last night, this weekend we're talking about 4 indications that we have experienced God's grace. 4 ways that you can know that you have not, kind of like Job, that you have not just like heard about grace, but like that you have actually experienced grace in a real and personal way. And so last night Colin talked about the first indication, which is that you were disturbed by grace. Right? That you're disturbed by it, that it almost seems too kind. Or maybe it's too good to be true. And so you might even bother you when you see someone, God showing grace to someone, you think, they don't deserve that. God, do you know what they did to me? They don't deserve your grace, right? Like you're disturbed by God's grace. And so this morning we're looking at the second indication that you have experienced God's grace. And the second indication is this. It's that you have been devastated by your sin. That you've been devastated by it. And the reason this is so important is because until you've been devastated by your sin, you will never fully understand your need for grace in the first place. And until you realize the depth of your sin,
You will never fully appreciate the magnitude of God's grace.
and I think the temptation for many of us is we usually tend to grade ourselves based on the people around us, right? We tend to grade on a curve. And so we compare ourselves to our peers to see how we stack up at things. And we do this with all kinds of things. We do this with sports and athleticism. We do this in school with intelligence. We do this with our bodies and how we look, with our humor and who is the funniest. And one of the other places we tend to do this is with our morality. Because it is in our nature to compare, we tend to look at the people around us and use them as the standard or the barometer to kind of see how we're doing. And so some of you might be doing this right now, and maybe it makes you feel terrible. Some of you might be looking at your peers, and you might be carrying a lot of guilt and shame, right? Because in your mind, you don't live up. You think, I can't be spiritual like that person. I don't have that what it takes. Like, man, they don't know about my past. They don't know about what I've done. And so you're comparing yourself, and you feel like, man, I don't live up. And others of you might be comparing yourself to your peers, and you might be thinking, you know what, I'm doing pretty good, right? I know I'm not perfect. We make mistakes, but we all do. But I'm not like that guy, or I definitely haven't done what she has done. But in either of those cases, whether you stack up poorly or well, if you find yourself comparing yourself to the peers around you in spiritual things, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure you've encountered God's grace yet. In fact, Jesus actually taught a parable that warns specifically against this line of thinking. Here's what it says in Luke 18.
He says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
And so in this parable, you have 2 men, right? The first is the Pharisee, a religious guy who is known for his moral behavior. And compared to his peers, he's a pretty good dude, right? Seems like he's following the rules. He's engaging in genuine spiritual disciplines like fasting and tithing, right? Like how many of us could say that we fast twice a week and give a tenth of what we get? Like outwardly, he's doing a lot of things pretty well. And the second guy is a tax collector, a position who at that time was known for being corrupt, right? And the parable ends with the more sinful guy being forgiven, while the less sinful religious one is the one who remains guilty. And the beauty of Jesus' parable is that it wars against our temptation to compare ourselves to one another, right? Our sense of justice is outraged by the conclusion because we're using the wrong standard. And so I want you guys to imagine a moment that we are going to have a long jump competition this afternoon. I'll stick with the track analogies. And so we're gonna see which one of you guys can jump the farthest. And so let's say that some of you guys can jump 12 feet, right? So some of you guys, you can jump 12 feet. And there's a handful of you who can jump 18 feet, so decently farther. And let's say there's one of you in the room who could jump 24 feet, right? You're a 24-foot long jumper. It's like an elite level distance. And so compared to your peers, one of you would leave here feeling pretty good about yourself, right? Maybe you could talk a little trash to your less athletic friends. One of you would be crowned the champion of the long jump. But now I want you to imagine that I told you that we were having this long jump competition over the Grand Canyon, and that your goal was to try and jump from one side to the other, right? A distance of somewhere between 4 to 18 miles, depending on which part you want to jump over, right? Fun fact for you, right? So at the end of this competition, would it matter at all which of us jumped the furthest, right? Is the person who jumped 24 feet going to be like talking trash to the 12-foot jumper on his way down the Grand Canyon, right? Like you're laughing because it's so ridiculous, right? It doesn't matter because all of us would fall so woefully short. No one cares what you can jump anymore, right? This is what it's like to be devastated by your sin. When you compare yourself to the people around you, the temptation will be to downplay your sin, to minimize it, maybe to convince yourself that I'm not that bad. But when you gaze upon the holiness of God,
it reveals to you just how far short you fall from the standard.
And the reason it's the tax collector who finds forgiveness in the parable and not the religious guy is because the tax collector is the one who's been devastated by his sin. Only one of them recognizes the giant gap and is actually asking God for help. And so if we go back to our passage in Isaiah, this is also what happens to Isaiah. Check it out, verse 6.
Says, then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for.
And now remember, Isaiah is expecting God to destroy him, right? He thinks he's toast. But because Isaiah has humbled himself, remember he cursed himself. He's like, God, I deserve this. I acknowledge my sin. Because he acknowledged and owned his sin before God, God extends grace to him. He says, your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for. And so part of the problem with downplaying our sin is that it downplays our need for Jesus. But the other problem with downplaying our sin is it also downplays the extent and the magnitude of God's grace. Now, this is something that DJ is going to talk about in much more depth later tonight. But the reality is when you downplay and when you minimize your sin, you also minimize God's grace. Right? When you walk around and you think that you only have a gap that's this small, you think, well, that's cute. Thanks, God. That was kind of you, right? But when you realize that you have a gap that is like infinitely big, bigger than you can imagine, it's only then that you can truly see and appreciate the magnitude of God's grace. And when you see the magnitude of his grace in your life, it leads to a place of overwhelming gratitude. It leads to a life of total surrender, and it leads to a place of both worship and obedience. And notice how the passage ends. Here's what happens next.
Says, then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, here am I.
Send me. And so immediately after Isaiah has this encounter with God, and right after he recognizes his sin and then he encounters God's grace, we find that God is looking for a volunteer, right? It feels kind of like, wait, what's going on? And God's just like, hey, I need a volunteer, right? And like a small child, Isaiah's like, God, pick me, right? He's like, here I am, like, send me, God, send me. And interesting enough, Isaiah doesn't even know the assignment yet. Like God had the other, which is kind of a dangerous thing, right? And because God was calling him to deliver a pretty difficult message. But Isaiah is just like, he's just so excited. He's like, God, I'm in. Whatever it is, choose me. And why does he respond that way? Because the reality is when you've been devastated by your sin and when you have encountered God's grace, the result is always, it's worship and obedience. Right? He's so, God, you're amazing. I can't believe you did this for me. And I don't have a way to repay you, but what I want to do is I want to just give you my life. Totally surrendered. God, I will go wherever you want me to go. I will do whatever it is you want me to do. And from this point forward, Isaiah is again sent out as a messenger, but this time he is being sent out to deliver a message that he once knew in theory, but now he knows through experience. Right? The message of grace that he was proclaiming before, it was head knowledge before, right? But like think Collins ice cream, it is now something that he has tasted and he knows it is good. And now he's delivering it to someone who's actually experienced the message. So I'm going to invite the band back up. And while they're coming, I want to close by asking you guys probably a really obvious, but a super important question. And here it is.
Have you ever been devastated by your sin?
Right? If one of the ways that you can know you have experienced God's grace is being devastated by your sin, then I think you owe it to yourself to consider this question. And again, we don't want to know that if you, like intellectually, do you understand the right answers to your sin and the depths of your sin? We want to know, have you experienced this? Is this something that you've actually had a moment where you have allowed God to just devastate you in the weight of your sin? And before you're quick to answer that question, let me just ask some follow-up questions to it. Questions like, do you still compare yourself spiritually to the people around you? Do you still find yourself using other people as your barometer instead of using God's holiness as a standard? Do you feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude in your life for God's grace? Do you feel completely unworthy of His grace? Is your life marked by worship and obedience? Is your life totally surrendered to God, or are there areas where you're still holding back? Finally, this, are you willing to go wherever God sends you? Are you someone who, like Isaiah, you're just like, God, wherever it is, I'm in. Pick me. Send me. Or as someone who has experienced grace firsthand, is this something that you are now sharing with those who are around you? Because the starting place to all of these is the same. It's being devastated by God's grace. And if you are someone who is there, if you are feeling that right now, my challenge to you would simply be to own it, to just say, yep, God, I deserve all of this. And then cry out to Him for help. And if you do, what Scripture teaches us is that God will meet you there and that you will experience firsthand God's grace in your life. Let me pray for us, and the band's going to close us out. Well, God, you are good. And
God, I recognize that a good chunk of this message is not fun.
God, none of us want to feel the weight of our sin and feel guilty and sit in that. God, even in a silly example, I did not enjoy being destroyed by Ryan Wilson. That was not fun. But God, it is good to be forced to face reality. And God, I think there is so much good that comes out of this moment. And so God, I do pray that for everyone in this room, as painful as it might be, that if they have never been devastated by their sin, that even now, that you would bring them to this place, that you would overwhelm them with their guilt, not so that we can sit in it, God, but so that we can truly understand and appreciate and experience truly your grace in our life. God, help us get there. We're grateful that you love us so much. It's in your Son's name. Amen.